Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. I am speaking to you from Nairobi, Kenya, so it's good evening from me. My name is Nanjala Nyabola, and I am very excited to be part of this conversation, part of this wonderful gathering of people from all over the world to think about, to talk about, to reflect on this wonderful text from Dionne Brand, A Map to the Door of No Return. I want to begin, before we dive into our session, I want to begin with marking the violent histories of the place where our gathering is hosted, making note of and reminding us of the ongoing conflicts and contradictions of the land, the water, and the air. The land is the territory of, where York University is hosted, is the territory of the Huron, Wendat, and Petun First Nations, the Anishinaabe, the Missaguas of the Credit River, and the nations of the Haudenosaunee. I'm so sorry if I pronounced that wrong. The meeting place of Toronto remains home to the Indigenous people from all over Turtle Island. These Americas are built on violence and erasure, and we bring these histories with us. Those native to this land, Indigenous people from other territories, as well as white settlers by conquest, and those of us who have come here by force or otherwise, as a result of slavery, colonialism, and imperialism, and ongoing wars. When we enter any room, even or especially virtual rooms like this, we must bring these histories into view. This acknowledgement is particular to Toronto, the location of York University, and the host of A Map to the Door of No Return at 20. But we are meeting together virtually from countries all over the world with their own histories of conquest, white settler colonialism, slavery, imperialism, and ongoing wars. And we must also acknowledge and bring these histories and presence into view. I wanted to acknowledge also in that breath that I am coming to you, as I said, from Nairobi, which is the ancestral homeland of the Maasai people. The word Nairobi obviously means a place of cool waters in the Maasai language, many of whom lost their homelands and their access to the cool waters due to the presence of the colonial state. So it is with this acknowledgement that we enter and we meet here in the hopes of making a different world. Before I get into introductions with our panelists, I just want to mention to everybody who is in the room, first of all, thank you for being with us here today. We are taking your questions. We're delighted to take your questions, and we invite you to use the Q&A function on Zoom. The questions will be collected throughout the conversation, throughout the presentations that we hear this evening, and we will get to them at the end when we enter into the space of conversation and of dialogue. So without further ado, I am going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker, and give them a chance to share their views and their experiences of this wonderful text. Our first speaker this evening is Natalie Diaz. Natalie Diaz was born and raised in Fort Mojave Indian Village in Needles, California, on the banks of the Colorado River. She's Mojave and an enrolled member of the Gila River Indian tribe. Her first poetry collection, When My Brother Was an Aztec, was published by Copper Canyon Press, and her second book, Post-Colonial Love Poem, was published by Grey Wolf Press in March 2020. She's a 2018 MacArthur Fellow, as well as a Lannan Literary Fellow, and a Native Arts Council Foundation Artist Fellow. Diaz was awarded the Princeton Holmes National Poetry Prize and a Hodder Fellowship. She's a member of the Board of Trustees for the United States Artist and is an alumni of the Ford Fellowship. Diaz is the director of the Center for Imagination in the Borderlands and is the Maxine and Jonathan Marshall Chair in Modern and Contemporary Poetry at Arizona State University. Natalie, the floor is yours.
Gracias for having me, Nanjala, for your generous introduction. Ayuanja hotan evak idum. I'm reading from, I don't write papers, so I'm reading from lots of note cards that I will title The Door, the Chair, and the Still Small Voice. When I read Dionne's work, when I read The Map of the Door to No Return, I hear her sea, and one of the many gifts and hauntings of that sea is that through it, I hear my desert, my ancient ocean, calling back to its first body of water and remembering me, that I am of something larger, a series of rivers that lead to the sea, small but among and alongside. A power I am only beginning to imagine, much less understand. I use the word body, a word I need for now. I say body in English and fill mat in Mojave or Makav, amat, imat, our relational land and body. I use body here and hold also that in English, body can be a violent disaggregation. She recognizes me not as human, but as her own imagination. I am granite reorganized, a formation yet forming. I dream with the mountain because I am of the mountain. Grief for my elemental life respires my body. My snakes lick me from the wind like a chemical, return me to electrical signal, a web of small lightning suturing the mouth to the skull. Pleasure, unlanguaged and noise. I was dreamed into being. I was the dreamer. Skin fleshes the world it's made of in overwhelm. Cloud shadow drifts a gray whale across the salt flats. A periphery of white halite crust surrounds its slow shade. My lover crystallizes the same way along the ridges of my knuckles and back of my hand, the dorsal side, as we also call a fin. I surfaced from deep submersion. There is no pleasure, not earthen or wet, ancient ocean, we say, and we mean every body. In Mojave, abuya is the word for door, from avaiya, or the mouth of the house. For us, the door is of language, a lexicon of sensuality. When I say door, I recall my body as also embodied, a relational presence. As Brand writes, the frame of a doorway is the only space of true existence. Within the frame she speaks of, I am in an overwhelm of its danger, the kind of danger that makes you unsure of which side of the danger you are on. Am I dangerous or am I in danger? It's always both. Existence contrives many ways in which we might occur. To stand, to come out or emerge, to appear, to be visible, to come to light, to arise, and even to be produced. There are existences predicated upon us never occurring. Brand writes, there is a sense in the mind of not being here or there, of no way out or in, as if the door has set up its own reflection. She continues, as through heat waves across a vast empty space, we see this door appearing and disappearing, an absent presence, which returns me to Mahmoud Darwish's book, In the Presence of Absence, and to Palestine and the Israeli-created condition of existence called present absentee, in which Arabs were displaced and massacred during the Nakba, and have been denied return to their homeland and denied citizenship if they manage to return. Door as a flickering of the body, but not a presence, shaped upon the body, for what it imagines persons on either side of its threshold are capable of, for what it believes persons on either side of its threshold deserve. I'm going to share a June Jordan image. I want to talk about furniture, and I'm bringing in June Jordan to our conversation to be alongside. This is a page from Jordan's notebook, and it was given to me by a friend and poet, Solmaz Sharif, whose research lies there. The text that's there on the page is this is Jordan's. It is not enough to say black. It is not enough to say love or beautiful or peace or even finally OM. How will black show beautiful and where? What will be the forms of love and peace? How to design tables and chairs for a really new life? Will we still use knives? How to design cities so that dancing all together will not appear ridiculous or worse, a televised special event. These designs of revolution require a turning away from the enemy. They require a kind of going up into the hills and mountains, as did Castro, scheming around the clock, a really different universe, or as did Elijah, tuning into a really different frequency, the still small voice. I'll stop sharing that. Though a door is not furniture, it requires furniture, which is the word for any technology that activates the door. And there is no door without its house, its complex or structure, each an architecture of our intimacies. But who are those architects, those master builders, and whose intimacies did those architects imagine by shaping and denying ours? I want to talk about the chair, conspirator to Brand's door. History is already seated in the chair in the empty room when one arrives, she writes. Furniture from fornitur, to supply or provide. In Spanish, we say muebles, meaning movable goods, property, possession, and good meaning what it's always meant, suitable for some purpose, suitable for someone's purpose. Furniture is intended to replicate the body, to do, not for the body, but in place of the body, a prophecy, an iteration and production that becomes muscle memory for forgetting the body of flesh and land and water from which it was extracted. In Makav, we have no word for furniture. The chair only exists because it is a thing my body does. Chair is a verb. In Makav, the chair has no body but mine, no sensuality or desire but mine. And still the complex of desire, as Brand writes, desires cling to chairs and houses, neighborhoods, the face of a television set. The same way Julius Caesar carried foldable furniture to wars to make them comfortable in the battlefield, or British Army engineers designed furniture in their occupation of India. Hernan Cortez patched the ships, the holes in his ships with mahogany planks. In Hebron, Palestinians cannot lock their doors so that Israeli Zionist settlers can come in and out of the doors as they please, in and out of their homes. And one of the most recent, at least media evictions in Palestine, in Sheikh Jarrah and Silawi or Silwan, is removing Palestinian families' furniture while they're away at a wedding or while they're out of the house and replacing it with settler furniture. The door determines who or what is apparati or furniture. The door and furniture each requires destruction and further requires us to trade our comforts for our comfort with that destruction. As Brand writes, we become the repetition despite our best efforts. We become numb. What does the door teach us to remember or want, and how does it determine our shape or shape our desires, what we hide, how we fuck or love, who we deny, the thresholds of violence, the inside and the outside? The door is a dangerous muscle memory, an iteration and repetition of the body, but whose and how. As Brand writes, books leave gestures in the body, a certain way of moving, of turning, leave certain sounds, certain pacing. The emotions they spoke of were perhaps contradictory to what one might simplistically call desire, but desire is disclosed as a complex. There is a range of experience within the space which is called desire. Desire's province widened into the flying pieces, their occasional collection, and into a movement or a color or a sigh, ever shifting, ever reimagined, which reminds me of Toni Morrison's Breedloves in the Bluest Eye, which Insong Kim reminded me about last evening. When Morrison wrote, from the tiny impressions they gleaned from one another, they created a sense of belonging and tried to make do with the way they found each other. And what Morrison further wrote about the Breedloves and their furniture, the furniture had aged without ever having become familiar. People had owned it, but never known it. There were no memories among those pieces, certainly no memories to be cherished. Furniture without memory, without the memories of the persons whose bodies it imagined or didn't, not only creates the conditions for destruction, but necessitates it. My question I'm asking myself after reading Brand's book is there a difference between being complicit with the door, our furnitures, the masters, the builders, and merely participating as prophecies of these architectures? On some days there are, in some countries there are, in a relationship to some bodies, maybe. And I'm going to finish with sharing this last video. The door, like the map, like the chair, is a muscle memory. My first life as an athlete was shaped on muscle memory, both my mind and body. When does this memory shift from how our body moves to how we imagine and can't imagine beyond the comfort of our bodies, beyond the lines, beyond having made a mark or reifying a boundary of where and when and of whom a body begins or is possible? In muscle memory, am I more my body or am I less engaged with my body? Certainly, I am sensual, though nobody ever said violence is not also a form of sensuality. Muscle memory, like the map, tells you where not to go. It stunts the imagination, a map of the body's desires as muted as already knowing where they will arrive, unecstatic. What future can the house have now? Can the door? What future did either ever have if it could become la maison des esclaves? Whether a mouth, a door, a hand, a nation, since one of them has been capable of the construction of the door of no return in dream, in material, in psychic or spiritual desire, can there ever be a mouth, door, hand, or nation not seated with its eventuality? Gracias.
Gracias, Natalie. Thank you so much for sharing that reflection. Very provocative and insightful images, connecting the body, memory, and the violences, I think, that bodies, endure, bringing Sheikh Jara into the room, truly, truly powerful. I'm going to turn now to Torkwase Dyson. I'm going to invite Torkwase Dyson to speak. Torkwase describes herself as a painter working across multiple mediums to explore the continuity between ecology, infrastructure, and architecture. With an emphasis on the ways Black and brown bodies perceive and negotiate space as information, Dyson looks to spatial liberation strategies from historical and contemporary perspectives, seeking to uncover new understandings of the potential for more livable geographies. In addition to participating in group exhibitions at the Smithsonian National Museum for African Art, the Whitney Museum for American Art, the Modern Museum of Art, the California African American Museum, Dyson has also had solo exhibitions and installations at Colby College Museum of Art, the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies, the Suzanne Lemberg Ustan Gallery, and the Suzanne Lemberg Ustan Gallery in Vermont. In 2020, Dyson's solo exhibitions included Black Compositional Thought, 15 paintings for the Plantagenocene, presented by the New Orleans Museum of Art, and I Can Drink the Distance, on view at Pace Gallery in New York. Torkwase Dyson lives in New York, and I'm going to invite Torkwase to take the stage.
Thank you all for having me. Mapping in 3 parts, holding place, grandmother from inside, enclosure, the bedroom as enclosure. What is sitting, pointing, directing? What of here-ness? What if my body becoming Black is proposing here-ness, geometry in place, holding a bed, holding a chair and a porch, to hold the hold as refusal? What can be made of holding everywhere from a place of here-ness? Minnie Evans from North Carolina. From the gate, she graphed beyond the beyond. The drawings are about here-ness, and they dispute the violent idea of a universal colonial now, refusing the universal now for the quotidian subject. Here, to understand the body as Black placeness is quanta geography. Sitting by the gate, a throughway, from there to everywhere, and stillness, the chair she draws, giving direction. Stephanie Jameson, Census Pleniar from 2017. Constructions of worlds from my body, threshold and beyond. Finding a way to tell us about the beyond in quiet, using the body as a throughway of precarity, the body of precarity, of blue, of distance, of eternity, of perimeter, of drawing, settle into eternity, head there now, a lovely distance from everything. Allison Hamilton, hours headed away. Things I have remembered unfolding in an open space. This is a creative project from Black stillness, unfolding to witness a new scene, a new plane, a new place of doors and terrible archways, legs of geometry. Brand writes, I have always been quite afraid of geometry. Thinking about movement through the text, I'm reminded with each line, with each word, with each moment, how geometry plays through the narrative of Brand's memory. Through this form, through this place, through this orientation, I understand that I return to the door that I move away from. This simultaneity is a becoming of Blackness that is insistence on both distance, desire, and beauty. This book makes me want to draw. I thought I was drawing with my fingers, my arms, and my wrist, but I am drawing from the perimeter, from my particles, from my fractals, from my distance, from my senses, from my desires, from my beauty. D. Soyini Madison writes, the only time travel in this present moment of from beauty calling, my apologies. I only time travel in this present moment of beauty calling, beauty, a desire. Oftentimes I make drawings, understanding the indelible tie from architecture to infrastructure to water of the blue. In this set of drawings, I continuously understand that with this liquidity, I am becoming more myself with every day. I'd like to read a segment of the text from Brand that play right into the way I think about painting. There are ways of constructing the world, that is, of putting it together each morning. There are ways of constructing the world, that is, putting it together each morning, what it should look like piece by piece. This constructing, this making is without linear focus. It's there and back and there again, searching for beauty while achieving presence. When I think about Brand's writings of her grandmother in the bed, pointing, understanding how these doors, these frames, these 7 doors and 2 windows I will not leave out of, has me wondering about imagination and my own imagination. What I've done now is to think about how to construct both what I think about as transient spaces of opacities, ideas of architecture that are both 2, 3, 4, 5-dimensional. What does it mean to create space after space, understanding that there is a return, and again, there isn't a way? How do I continue to make, as a drawer, as a painter, as a person who constructs things in the round, when Brand challenges consistently this idea of place becoming movement, the colonial strategies of consistently disappearing while I reappear in this present, knowing these throughways, knowing these curves, knowing the violence of these arches, but still belonging to the blue and having a consistent fidelity to the blue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Torkwase. What a wonderful, wonderful offering. Beautiful images. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I am going to turn now to Brandon. Brandon Shimoda is a Yonsei poet and a writer. His recent books include an ancestral memoir, The Grave on the Wall, which received the PEN Open Book Award, and The Desert. His book on the afterlife, or the ruins of Japanese American incarceration, also received a creative nonfiction grant from the Whiting Foundation, and the book is forthcoming from City Lights. Brandon, I invite you to the stage.
Thank you so much, Nanjala. It's an enormous privilege to be here. So I'm going to share an abridged version of a much longer desire to dwell in a single yet endlessly generative image from a map to the door of no return. It's called The Bottom Drawer, or The Beginning of Reading. My grandfather's life put the sound into my last name. My grandmother's life put the silence after it. Dionne Brand, St. Mary's Estate. A young girl is staring into a drawer pulled out of a wardrobe at a book that is falling apart. The girl is 8. The wardrobe is her grandmother's. The drawer is the bottom drawer. It's filled with sheets and pillowcases, and underneath them, cakes and sugar. So it's a special drawer because it's where the treats are. So it's everyone's favorite drawer, especially the children. And the drawer, which is deep, also contains 3 books: a Bible, a geometry book, and a book called The Black Napoleon. The Black Napoleon belongs to the girl's uncle, who put the book in the bottom drawer with the cakes and sugar because he wanted to keep it from the children. He told them, don't touch it. But he must have known they would touch it, because he must have known that children always know where the cakes and sugar are kept. Black Napoleon had no cover, no spine. The thread holding it together is almost rotted. Imagine the frequency and the intensity with which a book must be read for it to lose its cover, its spine, for its threads to be almost rotted. Imagine the frequency and the intensity with which it must be touched. Don't touch it, he said. And the next day, the girl, Dionne Brand, touched it. It's my favorite touching of a book in the history of literature, because the book, forbidden, therefore irresistible, is touched and read while still in the bottom drawer. The first time I read this touching moment, or this moment of touching, I envisioned a girl staring into a well to try to see what lives, or if anything is living, at the bottom, especially if that thing is forbidden, and seeing, rippling across the surface of the water, a face, which looks from that distance way down there like the face of someone else, but which is in fact her own face. The well, by the way, in Japanese folklore, which I take to be synonymous with reality, is a portal of redemption, up which the face rises, out of which the face rematerializes a wounded existence. Dionne Brand describes the act of reading the Black Napoleon as falling into its face, and the book as a mirror and an ocean. The book, the mirror, and the ocean conspired to present an education in the ubiquity and necessary concealment of, beneath the protective and preserving sheets and cakes and sugar, the ancestors. Early in this pandemic, I wrote to a few friends and asked them the following question: where do the ancestors gather, and or where do your ancestors gather? I was feeling disconnected and was realizing the feeling was connected to a deeper and more imperishable feeling of disconnection. My friends wrote back, within and around us, around bowls of water, around folding tables, around card tables, on the dance floor, wherever and whenever people march, in the streets, in libraries, in basements, in the folds of our skin, in between our bodies, in certain expressions of our bodies, in our senses, in our minds, in meditation, in prayer, in dreams, in questions, in conversations, in stories, in poetry, in caves, at the ocean, in every body of water that I have ever come across. The Bible belonged to Dionne Brand's grandmother. She often read it before falling asleep. I never got close to it, Dionne Brand writes about the geometry book. The Black Napoleon, meanwhile, was the book that took me away from the world. I remember certain names, she writes: Toussaint, Henri Christophe, Dessalines. I cannot recall the author. I've never checked to see if such a book actually existed. I prefer to think of it still at the bottom of the drawer, waiting for me to fall into its face. Please forgive my transgression, my betrayal of that preference. The Black Napoleon may or may not be a book by a man named Percy Waxman, best known, if known at all, for writing Broadway musicals. The Black Napoleon, like the Bible and the Book of Geometry, is a novel, although there is something hallucinogenic about the choice of fiction to tell the story of the Haitian Revolution. I say betrayal because I interlibrary loaned The Black Napoleon by Percy Waxman. There's a copy at Wichita State. It's falling apart, held together by a black bandage. A handwritten note on the inside cover says, "Will need to be sent to mending." The note is dated 1983. The need for mending is apparently unending. The book has not been checked out since 1988. It was published in 1931, the year Manuel Alvarez Bravo looked up from a book he was reading by Dostoevsky, stepped out of his apartment onto the balcony of his building, and saw across the courtyard a young girl leaning against the railing, staring down. He took a photograph, El Ensueño. When I first read Dionne Brand's description of staring into the bottom drawer, I envisioned, in addition to a girl staring into a well, El Ensueño. I envisioned something similar in the gravity that compelled the girls towards the bottom, staring as much into their future as into their past, the future born upon the momentous and ultimately inexpressible example and weight of it, if not something even more Mobius. This book filled me with sadness and courage, Dionne Brand writes. It burned my skin. I did not yet know how the world took people like me, she writes. I did not know history. When I finished, she writes, I was made, and was thereafter compelled through the bottom drawer and into writing, herself and her consummate all-encompassing stare into books, into mirrors and oceans. The final sentence of Percy Waxman's The Black Napoleon is, "The cherished dream of the old black coachman on Breda plantation had at last come to pass. And for the first time in the world's history, an enslaved people had succeeded in gaining their own freedom." The first sentence of Dionne Brand's A Map to the Door of No Return is, "My grandfather said he knew what people we came from." I imagine her grandfather in one room, trying against the widening consequence of ancestral severance to remember, and her grandmother in the other room, burying a book beneath cakes and sugar. "What led me to this book then," Dionne Brand writes, "were my senses, my sweet tooth, my hunger. I opened the book," she writes. "I opened the book, at first leaving the drawer open with the book lying inside, and began to read." Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon. Thank you so much for that offering. And for that image, really, of the bottom drawer and the relation between the book and I guess grandparenthood as memories, as memory keepers. Thank you very much. We're going to move on now to Kaie. Kaie Kellough is a poet, fiction writer, and sound performer. His work emerges at a crossroads of social engagement and formal experiment. His long poem, Magnetic Equator, won the 2020 Griffin Poetry Prize. His latest work of fiction, Dominoes at the Crossroads, was recognized with several national award nominations. Kaie has written plays for television and librettos for large musical ensembles. His solo and group sound performances have also toured internationally. Kaie, I invite you to share with us.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction. And thanks everyone for what you've shared just now. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'd like to read from something I've written kind of with, perhaps in response to or in parallel with a passage from A Map to the Door. This is called Outsides. For those of us who have lived in the small Canadian towns nestled into the prairie or hidden somewhere behind exits along the highway, we're familiar with existing beyond the reach of the diaspora. Out there, you never forget the distance between yourself and the central hubs of Black culture in Canada. It's startling then to encounter a passage in a book that explores a place you've known. You feel yourself being written. Does such an outside exist? Doesn't the diaspora extend to wherever our feet are planted? Maybe it does, but when we move outside of metropolitan centers, our presence thins to a shadow. When we travel to towns where no active communities of Black musicians shape new musical genres by night, where no Creoles from various islands banter and blend into a local idiom, suddenly, when the collective energy dips below a critical ebb, we are diminished. Unwritten rules discourage our celebration of color and style. Disapproving eyes may observe us. In response, hair can be tamed, covered, pinned down to avoid ridicule. There may be no room to flourish, to luxuriate in one's being and culture. To do so might prove dangerous because in some places, to emphasize your Black or brown self is to emphasize difference, which can invite hostility. To read about such places is to feel yourself recovered from obscurity, gathered up, and reminded that yes, your experiences belong within the embrace of the diaspora. They're not just the anonymous trivia of a lost life. The title of Dionne Brand's A Map to the Door of No Return ends with the words "no return," which somehow emphasize return, a return to the places we've been, the places we think we've left forever. One of the sections to which I've returned is about living in the country outside of Toronto by Concession 11. A familiar tension coils through this section. where the car is referred to as armor, and the mouth of the gas station attendant, a tight, thin wire. The terse understatement, money is not always the currency here, haunts the section, as it haunts the reality of Concession 11 and other similar places. In 2020, at the height of the pandemic, the idea of relocating from the city to the country became popular. My partner Melissa and I discussed this trend at length, not because we cared to move out of the city, but because we didn't. The city is a sanctuary for us. But if you drive less than 2 hours north or south of Montreal, numerous quaint towns extend the promise of walks along bucolic trails, reflective bodies of water, a reprieve from the city, which can seem like a machine that produces anxiety. We consulted articles about the townships. We listened to friends and coworkers discussing desires to purchase homes close to Mont-Tremblant. Some people we knew relocated. In the summer of 2021, we got our chance to experience country life. With a critical eye and some apprehension, we planned a month out of town in an area north of Montreal called Saint-Faustin-Lac-Carré. In our first week there, we were noticed. We were discussed as we shopped for groceries. The reactions to our presence shifted from surprise to bewilderment, even to discomfort. We spoke our urban French and received, in return, even tighter grimaces from the locals. Naturally, we expected this. I had to return to Montreal for a week for some audio recording. I felt relieved to be back in town. I didn't miss the country neighbor who would fire up his barbecue while wearing a bathrobe, slippers, and while smoking a spliff. I didn't miss pickup trucks or sunglasses perched atop baseball caps. I didn't miss the way my neighbor would cock his head and peer into our yard. Two things happened when I returned to the city. First, in Little Italy, an Italian butcher politely asked me how old I was. I told him. He replied that he was the same age, that people of our age must take care of ourselves, and that we have a responsibility to take care of each other. He told me to make sure I stayed safe and wore my mask because, he shook his head, these are terrible times. Then, at a cafe up Park Avenue, a North African barista with curly brown hair looked at me and said, in French, curly hair. And I said, oui, les cheveux frisés. And he raised his voice, announcing to the room, curly hair is beautiful. It goes with everything. You can't go wrong with curly hair. It was a spontaneous affirmation from the city. When I returned to the country, we again visited the grocery stores and again encountered stares and puffing out of chests, startled looks as we browsed the vegetables, near paralysis as we requested rainbow trout. Drivers slowed as they passed us on our walks. But this time, after a brief immersion in the city, I bristled and resented the local welcome. I despised the feeling of being exposed and vulnerable, where even if I could speak the language, language was not always the currency there. Sometimes those first few words in French produced alarm and even recoil, as if I had not only trespassed upon what the locals considered their territory, but had violated their tongue. One night, I was upstairs reading late. Melissa was asleep downstairs. To my right was a window, and outside, above the window, was a motion-sensing light with like two lights. And on top of the light was a bird's nest. So when the birds left or returned to the nest, the light would flick on, flooding the room, illuminating the driveway below. At some point, I fell asleep. I dreamed that I was awakened by the motion-sensing light. So I stood and went to the window. In my dream, I looked out the window, and a blue pickup truck was standing, running in our driveway. The high beams were on, stretching into the trees. The doors were open, but nobody was inside the truck. It took a few seconds for me to understand what I was looking at. It meant that at least two people were outside in the middle of the night, somewhere on the property. My thoughts flashed to all the doors of the house. Was the patio door locked? Melissa was sleeping downstairs. I had to locate a weapon and check the doors and windows. I somehow knew that the truck belonged to men we'd seen at the grocery store. The next morning, I described the dream to Melissa. She was more disturbed by the depth of my discomfort, which the dream indicated, than by the dream itself. The dream is a reminder of many things, of my childhood in Alberta, of how much of a sanctuary the city of Montreal has become, of how the nightmare of exposure to violence is thinly disguised, for some of us, by urban life. The passages in A Map to the Door of No Return that are set at Concession 11 recall this state of being alone, tense, vulnerable. The passages inhabit these outside places and consider how Blackness survives them. Thinking and writing about these outsides does not make them home, but it allows us to feel that they have been visited, braved, perhaps challenged. Their mention also does something magical in the way of a blues singer who mentions the small, countrified places they visited, places that are beyond the gaze of urban ambition, of the culture world and its sophistications. In those brief mentions, the diaspora reaches out, even if the mention warns us against visiting or recounts an experience so bitter that it taints the blood. That place still merges with myth because it has been articulated, it has been gathered into the collective narrative. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kaie. Thank you so much for that image. That statement, curly hair is beautiful, is an affirmation that not a lot of Black girls hear anywhere in the world. Black people really hear anywhere in the world. So to hear that sort of having that impact on you, very familiar sensation. Thank you for that offering. Finally, we're going to hear from Canisia Lubrin. Canisia is a writer, editor, and critic. Her books are Voodoo Hypothesis, and I still don't know how to pronounce this, Canisia, so you'll forgive me, The Dysgraphicist, and Code Noir, which is forthcoming from Knopf. In 2021, Lubrin won the Griffin Poetry Prize, the O.C.M. Baucus Prize for Caribbean Literature, the Derek Walcott Prize, and the Wyndham Campbell Prize in Poetry, among others. Lubrin is the inaugural Shaftesbury Writer-in-Residence at Victoria College at the University of Toronto, and she's an assistant professor and incoming Master of Fine Arts. My other work is in Foreign Affairs, so my head just went straight to Foreign Affairs. Incoming Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing Coordinator at the School of English and Theatre Studies at the University of Guelph, where she completed her MFA in Creative Writing. Canisia, if I may invite you to share the stage.
Nanjala, thank you so much. I am very thankful that you are our guide through these fields of imagining in this hour and a half. Thank you to Natalie, Torkwase, Kaie, Brandon for being my companions and co-conspirators. I will read something here called I Travel with the Poet. I am packing for the future. A poet is here with a map to the door of no return. Page 53, finding a compass. In cities at 4:45 a.m., Toronto or Calgary or Halifax, there are these other inhabitants of silence. I am with few others, while the afternoon is late or early, if you're elsewhere looking in or out. From here, I cannot say that we've all followed this road the same, but we have come this way together. For a few days, I think about the distance between Kisii County, Kenya, to this place of green lurching hills with a metallic light that keeps its exact quality undisclosed. I know it by the cluster it makes in me, where I feel pure pleasure. Because what more can I ask of light? What can I truly ask of light? But I am writing this now, not in that original late or early afternoon, because a pendulous memory has found me. And the tense of the map is always, always was, and is. Though mother and body also make a mythic, metaphoric sense, a tense, as the poet offers, in a map to the door of no return. I could even borrow her phrases of inquiry from page 90. My journey is more than 8 hours long, down the belly of Africa. Why do I slip into the easy enough metaphor of Africa as body, as mother? Is it because the door induces sentimentality? The idea of return presumes the certainty of love and healing, redemption and comfort. True, I had written similar sentiments in a poem. A disclaimer about the light, the inexpressible in it. I find the door ajar, alloyed to somebody with an idea of return's presumptions. Love, uncertain. Healing, unrequested. Redemption, unsettled. Comfort, unexplicit. Presume that a poet sees in the light through, if not its symbols, its beauty. The quality of light I remember in my childhood is gentle ferocity, 20 and 30 years ago. About this light I meet in Kenya in 2018, I wonder whether to alert my companions. They are various in their surprises and misshapen entrances into Africa. Its real and imagined streets, all of them like me, are here for the first time. Do they also feel this light? Its manner? Do I think of the light because it is easier to think of than all else I have ferried this long way? A silence thick with doors nobody respects until they have something to protect. Give me a new amplitude for a world that never gave me purity or innocence, save for maybe light, measured in these few movements between an absence, or as the poet puts it, a healing and redemption. I think observing light is ordinary now that I am making a catalog and packing for the future. I must note the manner of my companions from America, Armenia, Poland, Norway, Greece, their incessant need to document everything they see. I harbored no such luxury. Everything, beginning with my breath in this spot of Kenya, moves in interrogative sense, interrogative tense. What was peace, innocence, redemption to me? Some comforts were brief. A meal here and there, some tenderness, companionship of profound and lasting regard were root. Roots have entered the catalog. I am packing for the future. Note this well. I leave the poet and her compasses alone for now, I convince myself. My own first journey to Africa, to its far east, is mapless. The door is not merely locale, the poet has signaled. I must learn, as we all must, the door as I, ever moving, ever present, the quietude of air travel, in and between flight for 2 days. I wonder why time zones collapse the unmanageable between great distances into a kind of ghostly domesticity, a place for the disruption of holding still. Like the poet, though, I've followed a route of my travels from Pearson to Toronto to Heathrow in London to Jomo Kenyatta in Nairobi. Into the busyness of the plane's digital map, I pour all of my anxieties about this going because I had learned history. But what is it to go back to where I haven't been? I am packing for the future. Pearson, Heathrow, Jomo Kenyatta, who are these men? Why must I know them? Temperatures of history's fevers, and we, thermometers, always testing the intensity at which continuity becomes fallacy and discontinuity becomes fantasy. What names accord to ports of entry is always disequilibrium. Even and especially when one can identify the rightness or wrongness of such naming. The features of presences, enough to outstrip potent conversations with oneself, high up in the air. These are general, but not lost on me, as I move by plane, imagining no cargo for this freight of being. Observe how I move, how I travel with restlessness, combusting the compass. I am making a catalog. I am packing for the future with the poet's signposts. Page 52, finding a compass. It is 4:45 a.m. I am awake in the foreign country of silence. Days into Kenya, we are on a broken and breaking bus, and my eyes close momentarily, and I feel something like the earth, but not in a way that makes me want to inherit it. Much of the events of the day before made me presume we would run out of something vital, and far from what would remedy the need, like air, the way rubber tires need air, like gas in a world of torque and tanks and the combustion engine, of restless revolving doors. And the bus driver never stopped once for gas in 6 hours. But we arrived, and I was pleased to be wrong. We had moved along smooth pitch and patchless roads with potholes, some so large, someone remarked. It is daytime when you roll into them, sunset by the time you hit the bottom, and sunrise again when the bus plateaus. And isn't that a revolving door? This familiar movement in islands, archipelagos, and cities. When we did arrive, it was like bouncing up with a place that knew to expect among the living, people who had once been dead and who come again with newly replaced eyes. Eyes sponsored by the heads strictly of foreign experts who finally decided this place and its people are for their camera to return to Paris or somewhere else in history. Does anyone in France, Portugal, Spain, Belgium, London, do they know about scrutiny and anxiousness and what it means to disembark where your memory is raised? I knew this story once, but it is different now. Someone I love is in it, happy and healthy. It might have been you who told me that story. It travels the deserts, troubles the coasts, finds some way through storm and monument on the way to us in small rooms on any island. Through that wrecked, light-filled city where we lived gargling salt water to keep 12 generations alive. This is how we learn to breathe through water. We learned this first from someone up along a family tree right after we were taught about hair and toothpaste and why never to use ashy elbows like a clock. How long ago? And why haven't you? Page 58, Voyage. In the room at 4:50 a.m., Aimé Césaire is writing. I should discover once again. I should say storm. I should say river. I should say tornado. I should be wet by all rains, made damp with all dews. I am making a catalog, packing for the future. Many talking people on the decrepit bus with their remarks. What are these pink trees, do you think? How many people do you think it might take to make one of these mud huts? Well, at least we're no longer sitting under some ancient tree in the middle of nowhere you could think of, waiting to be infected with malaria. And look how beautiful, so beautiful these poor, you think, people. As though every facet of any place We're merely fodder for their bland, dangerous kinesis. If we can be that generous, let us. Otherwise, I don't think that what they are doing is actually thinking, though at every turn, nearly every corner contains a deadly thought. I know what you are thinking. You are here and taking the evidence of your thoughts with you to a river somewhere to wash them clean of compliance with the door. Locked door, open door, missing door, miraculous door. But I move far, far too quick ahead. Parts of me feels fine being so near these fields. If I can imagine how fields imagine, that would be a luck. That was my first thought. What emanates from this county, all the yards, all red. The British spellings caught on the edge of my mind. I try to think of the decades between these spellings and the Indian Ocean. I think I can smell a full 2 countries away. But first, this road. Along this stretch, along either side of its interior, coffee plants and maize vibrating like bronchioles, little exposed lungs separating the smallest hills all around, as though they know to reject what is projected as their job, a duty to be demonstrative, to perform something that looks miraculous, and then for someone to say, look how beautiful, as though the door breaks every compass. I am packing for the future. Like the 12 years someone we loved spent in the valley with the planting, the endless herbicides banned nearly everywhere else, the endless moving, insists. Page 73, compass. That dislocation, that suddenly not knowing where you are or from which point to ascertain your bearings. And here we get off the dangerous bus around noon that day to the wailing greetings of village women, the greetings like wailing. Are they sent to greet us like this? And then the singing, dancing, more vigorous. And that good feeling of a whirlwind tunneling down some small world of things picked me up. And then the Europeans, one at a time, each tapped on the shoulder, taken away by one of the singing, wailing women, everybody dancing. But I could not dance, though I delighted in a butterfly hovering over my head. Besides, no one had tapped me on the shoulder. No one had taken me away. Someone announced belatedly, we will go separately with the women and convene later for tea. Why am I content to remain unseen as a dweller of the door? But one of the guides suddenly leans one of the singing women toward me by tilting his head up and poking his lips out. This familiar gesture, familiar. He would have preferred it if I didn't see this, I'm sure. So I smile at him to make sure he knows that I know. His one index lifting tentatively in my direction, his hand on the shoulder of the elder woman. I lean back, further back, thinking that I've been fine to go completely unnoticed. But was I noticed? I could not be anyone special among the local people, among the foreigners, in one of the oldest villages in the world, not too far from the Great Rift Valley. And now the elder woman, familiar by resemblance, walks to me somewhere near the Great Rift Valley. Just the day before, I had spoken and been spoken to in Kiswahili. I had responded in English, even though I wanted to respond in Creole, because it was the Creole I had heard in the inflections of Kiswahili, which led me to respond, which caused my companions to marvel that I understood them. I did not understand them. I laughed and amused them without understanding. We found a thing of echoes, and maybe a knowing that language can hurry us toward a door open. I don't know who you are, I want to tell the old woman, who so looks like a woman I've known. Do I really not know who you are? I say to her. She doesn't understand me, and our interlocutor is too far away to hear my question and translate. She gestures yes. She points in the direction of her home and invites me to walk. Do I really not know who you are? Am I a question mark? A distance traveled, an opening in the middle of the road with history, clogging and clearing all my pores. This is not a philosophical question. It is an entrance, an exit, an insistence, and a letter I am not sure ever to mail. I suspect leaving is not the same as having left, just as a door is not always a point of return. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that offering, Canisia. That was beautiful to hear and to read. And it's interesting to hear you write about this, about your experience in Kenya, because I actually wrote about my experience in Haiti. Kind of hearing the echoes of language and finding that your body, your mind remembers things that you shouldn't remember, and language kind of histories and memories being carried in words and concepts that are familiar and yet not familiar. Like, I don't understand Creole. I never understood it at the time. I never spoke it, but you know, every other word catching, like, hey, we have that word. That word means the same thing. In Kiswahili, it means the same thing in my mother language, and that familiarity, but also it's a disorienting familiarity, right? Because like you describe it, the invisibility kind of cutting both ways, wanting to be seen, but also finding some kind of safety and pleasure in being unseen. Thank you so much for that offering, and thank you for that submission. We are going into conversation. I just want to remind the people who are tuned in that you can use the question and answer feature on Zoom to submit your questions, and we will share them with our wonderful panel. I am going to start us off with a brief conversation as we wait for the questions to come in. Please do send them in and we'll curate them and we'll put them to the panel. But I don't know if the MFA comment gave it away, but as I said, I am not a poet. My work is in technology and politics, but I love to think with people who are using different ways of knowing to handle the world and to process the world. And some of the images that really stood out to me when I read Map to the Door of No Return. Well, first of all, this door, which I think, Canisia, in your presentation, you touched on, and I think Brandon as well, this idea and this panel of this idea of the door, because of course, a door is something that functions in both directions, right? They are the people who were taken through the door, and they're the people who stayed behind. And there's a section in the book about Henry Louis Gates Jr. sort of asking this very uncomfortable question of this Ghanaian man, why did you sell us? And it's very sort of like, bro, why? But as I read this whole book, you know, being an African in Africa, being able to trace back my ancestry, not through writing, but through words and through stories. You know, like my mother's generation is the first writing generation of my family. So seeing for me the door from the other side and the experiences from the other side. And I wanted to lean into that idea a little bit more, which is how we can be in conversation with each other as people who are on either side of this door in a way that doesn't flatten, or Canisia, you use the image of the resisting that idea of rushing to Africa as a body, right? The metaphor of Africa as a body, because this is the struggle that I think we have, making our lives intelligible to each other from either side of the door. So I wanted to lean in that a little bit, and I'm gonna go with you first, Kaie, because I like the way you speak about otherness in this small town in Montreal, and seeing that from the outside. How do you think, or what are your offerings, sharing about this idea of being in conversation on either side of this door, and the violences that we both have had to endure, that both sides have had to endure, and how do we not end up at the point where we're driving slowly down the street, you know, making eyes at each other at the grocery store in the same way that you're experiencing in this small town in rural Canada?
Thank you. That's a good question. And what it brings to mind is actually a topic that I like to think about often, which is the way sometimes the way music travels throughout the diaspora. Like you'll have musical techniques that come from Africa and that inform musicians from the Caribbean, and then music that's made in the Caribbean or in African America that returns to the continent and influences what musicians in Africa are playing. And there's this kind of infinite looping reciprocal relationship and ongoing conversation within the music about the progress of the music, but also about life, about the rhythms of place and how those translate from one place to another, about time, and about all of the complexities of human feeling, from some of the subtlest, finest, sweetest things you can feel to some of the roughest, right? And I don't know exactly how to take that from that example, but I do feel that that also happens it happens throughout the arts, right? It happens in the visual arts, it happens in music, it happens in literature, of course. But the way that that conversation happens in such a beautiful and respectful fashion, and where it doesn't only benefit the immediate participants, the benefit is greater. It sort of exceeds the form, and it belongs to everybody, or it can potentially belong to anybody who is interested. That is kind of the example that I would look to, although I wouldn't know exactly how to implement it in another form.
No, and we don't after practical answers, because like I said, this is the joy for me for being on a panel with poets, because so much of the work that we do in political science, it has to be solutions, or we have to go out and fix the world. And I think there's so much need to imagine and to broaden and to bring in all of these ideas. So thank you. That was a wonderful response. Natalie, I wanted to come to you because you brought Sheikh Jarrah and Palestine into the room. And of course, the second half of the title of this book is No Return, and the idea of return. And of course, that for Palestinian people, we think about the Nakba and being forced to leave, of the severance that comes from that, that separation from place. I don't even know how to frame my question, because I really got stuck on this when you were speaking about this idea of returning and no return. Because can you return to a place that isn't there anymore? Like for Palestinians, it's a generational thing, right? You're talking about some people whose homes will literally still be standing and taken from them, like the image that you gave us. But we're also talking about people, the 67, communities, people whose homes have been turned into something else. So I just wanted to invite you to think a little bit with us about this idea of return and no return, and the pressure that it puts on memory and a recollection. And sorry to make this even a denser question. Dionne writes about going to Johannesburg and going to South Africa. If you go to Cape Town, District 6, which was demolished to make room for a white settlement in Cape Town. It was a colored community that was demolished to make room for a settlement. And you meet, 40-year-old, 50-year-old women who'll say, that was my house, before I was kicked out to make room for this white settlement. So I just wanted to invite you to think with this, because you brought Palestine into this room and this idea of ecumenical Blackness, where we have this burden of no return. Can we go back to places that have changed so much?
Yeah, gracias for the question, and just for being alongside all of you. I'll come through the lens of I'll just come through the lens of language. So I'm in my homelands, so I'm joining you there. So already the condition in which I exist is different. It's also very same. What does it mean to wake up in the United States and to say I am native, or to be in my university, which is on top of my native lands? I think I think that language is, I mean, one, it's not the body, right? It's our estimations and guesses of the bodies. It's the stories we try to tell of ourselves. And it's sometimes in telling those stories, we're also not carrying the stories of others. And how to make the space for allness. I think it's beyond simultaneity. I think it's about, I think it's beyond our imaginations if we are speaking in certain language such as English. You know, if the return can only be to a particularly defined place of origin, I don't know that that can ever happen. And so origin, I mean, Dionne has me thinking quite rigorously about origin because it's such an important word. I see the mountain where my people came from, and I see where we leave. I look south. And I guess the thing that I am thinking a lot about is just etymologically. I mean, that's sometimes the easiest way to come back to a word is etymologically, and that origin is about rising, which implies a descent or a descending, you know. And I guess for me, the place where I find the corner and the snag is that we can imagine that there is time, you know, and we're so marked by time and what a thing is, and the idea of preservation, that the house is gone, and yet is the relationship with the house gone? And where does memory take place? I had a conversation last night about this, but sometimes language locks us into memory as having had happened, whereas I believe memory is also still happening. And I believe it has the capacity to carry all of those difficulties, those injuries, those wounds. And so I guess one of the things I wonder is if we can step out of the structures of memory, and I believe a house is a structure of memory. And Dionne pressures this with, like, you know, is this the location? Is this the place? Is the door the place? Is the door the location? Is the door the metaphor? What if we step out of the structure of the metaphor, and suddenly when we step outside of that, or when we step outside of the English language, we are already there in some way. I'm using the we quite loosely right now. And of course, I always mean an Indigenous we, but I'm trying hard to be alongside as well. And so I guess that's one of the ways I'm thinking, and especially in relationship to Palestine and the fight there, the refusal to be moved again, the always struggle to come back. And in many ways, it's not about the house. It's about the land. It's about the olive tree. It's about the unknown. And I guess that's maybe where I'll leave it, is that the field of the unknown is someplace I might be able to return to. It feels like an ancestral place, even though I'm supposed to be carrying it with me. And so I try really hard not to let the thing I'm returning to ever be a structure of place, and somehow to try to imagine it as a relationship of place. Not a great answer. I guess no, I'm thinking about the Rufous hummingbird, right? And like, you know, when it says it's drawn, like its desires are controlled by the nectar in the flower, and what that hummingbird leaves of the flower. Like, what is it of memory that is also absence, that is also letting you know what you desire and you deserve, which in some ways is a kind of sweetness.
That's wonderful. I mean, and I think, and honestly, it was really encapsulated kind of, I also gave you a very vague question because I think you encapsulated what I was trying to get at, which is the justice in the return to the physical thing, or is it in the act of giving ourselves space to return, like for memory to live, for memory to find that fullness and to find that restitution in itself? And that it was a wonderful answer. I have so many questions, but I'm going to turn to a question from Samantha Jones for any of the panelists. The session took us to many places in the world. I am curious to hear your thoughts on how a map to the door of no return takes readers and the diaspora to multiple places, both external and internal to the self as a method of seeking the feeling of home. And I'm loath to paraphrase anybody, but to focus on that last portion, I think, does the book take us to multiple places, both external and internal, as a method of seeking the feeling of home? Torkwase, can I come to you first? Your mic's muted.
My apologies. Thinking about that question of methods, particularly I think the way Dionne writes and structures geography and understanding and belonging to this always interstitial kind of condition. So I think it's, for me, I'll say for me, when I understand the way she conditions the quotidian next to a geography that's both phenomenological and existential, for me, that's a structure. And I can follow it in the studio in a way that when I think about sort of didactically historical text, things become more fleshy, right? So for me, the reading of the, I'll say moments of when we're clearly following her worry about snow, or we're clearly following her thinking about surface or memory, or Toni Morrison, or those characters, or other writers. Like, she's so acutely aware of letting the subjective condition of all of these planetary Blacknesses allow us back into our own bodies. There's something, when I read maps and listen to her other texts, it always jolts me to scribble or write something about how to reapproach something I thought I already knew, how to slow down and pay attention to what I'm looking at. And also, I think this book helps me watch my own thoughts, right? It allows me, the way in which she structures, these questions around Blackness and perimeter, it's also as if I'm reading someone help me think about my own spiritual practice and watching myself and watching my thoughts in front of me. So I would say to that question, yes. Yes.
Thank you very much. Brandon, you had something to say about that?
Well, I think I was thinking about this question in relation to the previous question and what Natalie was saying about the return in relation to the unknown. There's a sentiment, or maybe an assertion, that Dionne Brand repeats a few times in the book about when you're traveling somewhere, once you've left, you've already arrived, or you're entering into this space where in anticipation of the arrival, you've already started to transform into the person who has arrived in that particular place. And I think now, just listening to everybody thinking about this relationship to home and return, and also belonging as a process, and a process that engenders storytelling and all of these really kind of interesting and imperative rituals that don't replace the fact of a home, or don't replace the fact of a location to return to, but maybe do something very different that generates something complementary to it. And I've been thinking about this word belonging in the title, Notes on Belonging, and I started to have this wishful thinking that the definition of belonging was to be long, to elongate oneself, kind of grow into a space, so that it's less about the space than what is happening to you in it, and the way that you can kind of inhabit a certain shape, and become a certain shape. These are all sort of semi-connected thoughts, but
Can I say something else when you're Brandon? Sorry.
yeah, please.
No, please go ahead. Be in conversation.
Yeah,
with each
please.
Talking about that piece around belonging, I think what's helpful for me in this book is the way in which she faces the senses, right? That I'm now aware after, engaging this book and having my face now fall flat into it, that my senses are my home, right? So that when I'm moving through the text and I understand incidences that she uses to talk about this indeterminacy, she places me back into both the haptic, and I'm aware, again, that I'm operating on these multiple senses because of this everywhere, nowhere, belonging simultaneity. So this sort of the refusal of colonial and homeness, I think, in relationship to all of the bullet points I have from this book, is to remind myself in my work is that my senses are continuously my home, and that quotidian is continuously my home. When the projects of the modern and colonial dispossession mandates that we only have 5 or none or 1. So I think that's another methodology or practice that this book allows.
Thank you, Torkwase. Canisia, did you have anything to say about that question
Sure.
from Samantha?
Sure. I actually would resist the formulation that a map to the door of no return is at all interested in finding the feeling of home. That the danger with that sort of formulation is that it makes the very idea of our being and our location a kind of neutral space where one arrives and one can look back and simply sit with a kind of nostalgia that says, there's something entirely missing, that I am inadequate before. And I don't think that's what is in a map to the door of no return. Nostalgia is not the only orientation we have to loss, right? Certainly nostalgia is valid in wherever that, an abjection, certainly. But one of the reasons why I focus on those passages with voyage and compass and silence is in fact for the way that the door, as both metaphor and fact and physicality, the way silence trains our attention on what is possible. In fact, what we're always returning to is our lives. We return always to our lives when all the terrors of the world continuously pull us away from the fact of our living. And so my repeating, unpacking for the future, this is, we are moving always together and differently toward this sense of what is possible. Because if we sit too much in this sense of finding a sense of a home, then how am I here with Natalie? How am I here with Brandon? How are you and I here, Samantha and Torkwase, right? And so the way that it disrupts the kind of binary thinking, either you're home or you're not, is one of the things that I find foundational to what it rejects. Yeah, which is this dangerous kind of nostalgia. And so it's where we are and how we move through that, that kind of compassing.
Thank you, Canisia. I want to follow Natalie's lead and bring the specific geography into the conversation. For me, it was particularly poignant to be reading. I literally just read the book in 4 hours. It was so wonderful. At a moment when my next door neighbor, the country next door, is plunging into unprecedented crisis. So very briefly, the conflict in Ethiopia escalating and based on difference, right? And the idea of global Blackness is one that has very tenuous practicality in Africa, because difference shows up in unexpected places, that communities, there are communities that are 1,000 people and distinguish themselves and want that difference and want to be distinct from the community of 10,000 people that's down the road. So reading at a moment with the crisis of Ethiopia looming, the phrases that stood out for me: nation states are configurations of origins as exclusionary power structures which have legitimacy based solely on conquest and acquisition. And the idea of origins, I think we've touched on very lightly, because I think the thing that, hearing you speak and reading this book in this moment, thinking about how origin functions and also how the body, the idea of the body functions in politics, in the way we do life. There's something that you said about belonging, Torkwase, I think you're the one who said this, about our 5 senses and our bodies belonging to ourselves. But I look at this war and I look at how difference is constructed in the minds of those who have power. And I think to myself, do our bodies belong to ourselves if our Blackness, if our identities are constructed by power? And can that ever be home if yourself is constructed by someone else, right? To suit someone else's aspirations. Body, Natalie, you put this thought on the table, body as violent disaggregation, because that is how some people experience body, that separation is not just about leaving a physical place, but also of yourself, becoming abstracted of yourself because of other people's projections onto you. So I guess I want to put this on the table, a map to the door of no return in this moment in the world where it feels like everything is spinning out and there is so much crisis on so many of our doorsteps. The passages on Grenada and being in the middle of that, thrusting us into the middle of this urgency. Where is return? Like, what does return represent in this moment? And especially in the way in which we are facing this crisis of being told what it means to be of or to be from by power and by people who are determined to pit different groups against each other. It's a very big abstract thought, but it was really what stayed with me reading this book in the shadow of all of this news of war right at our doorstep. Anybody who wants to respond first? Kaie?
Thanks
don't
for
expect
putting
an
me on the
answer,
spot.
just a reflection.
Thanks. Before I answer though, I do want to say to Torkwase, it seems like you and I read the same passages and really invested in the same passages and thought about them a lot. You had mentioned the part where Dionne talks about waking up in the morning and putting your world together. And that passage came just after the ones that I've read over and over the years about being at Concession 11 and the car is armor in that part of Ontario. But the only thing I can really say is that what I do love about the book is the way it complicates the questions of return. if you return, it's not like going to the store and buying something. It's not like you have an idea of what you want, you go to the store, you find it, you purchase it, and you leave with it. And that thing is now part of your life in the way that you envisioned it to be. It's not a transaction like that, and it's not a convenient transaction. Return is always really complex and fraught, and there's a lot at stake personally. It's very stressful. It doesn't necessarily mean that suddenly you'll return and then belonging is the end result, right? It could be alienation. It could be uncertainty. It could be a lot of things that you have to work through. And I think that in a moment like ours, where the world is so troubled, and the differences between people in different places become so exacerbated on the level of security, safety, class, money, that return is even more complicated now than how we may have thought of it 25 years ago or 30 years ago. But return is, and so that, I mean, that's what I just wanted to pitch as part of my thinking about return, and the way that the book engages the complexities of return.
Thank you so much, Kaie, and thank you for letting me put you on the spot. Does anybody else want to reflect on that question? We are over time. Thank you so much for staying with us, people who are on the call. Yes, Torkwase, please go ahead.
I just wanted to say about terror, and chaos and disruption, and to say the passage where Dionne is, what's happening is she's at a friend's house. There's bombing outside the window. They're inside architecture. She's putting on her shoes. Everybody's putting on their shoes. They're getting ready. Do you know what I mean? So that's where I think reading text, this kind of book, allows us to say, like, what does survival in these, this ongoing intended chaos look on our bodies? So when I say the senses, I can feel when Dionne is talking about these moments, she's taking us step by step in this moment of, again, I have to survive. This is my life. Will I be here tomorrow? The urgency, I think, in the ways in which the writing places us where it's always an upheaval. It's always the project of the modern. It's always an extraction, and it's always an abstraction, right? So if your question is to say, well, how do we develop and be in this constant abstraction, is that we have a power in abstraction itself. We can survive it through abstraction, right? Surviving abstraction through abstraction. And so this level of, just to think about global war and terror and bombing, and that passage where, I'm American, the United States was throwing bombs everywhere, this kind of terror that's consistent. I mean, I don't know if I have an answer to that, but I do understand that in terror, the way Dionne, or I enter response, is how to feel impassioned and emboldened by someone who has the wherewithal to put on their shoes and their socks and get ready, with all of these other things going on. I mean, that's warrior talk, Yeah.
Thank you so much for that image, Torkwase. We are over time, and so I have to wrap the conversation. I want to say thank you to every single person who has spoken today, all of our panelists. Your offerings have been wonderful to engage with and have been really insightful for me, especially, like I said. I love thinking with people who are working with arts and the poetry and imagination, because I think it's something that you've given me so much to work with, I think, and to imagine with, and I'm so grateful to have had the opportunity to be here with all of you. Your offerings have been astounding. Thank you for everybody who's put this wonderful event together, and of course, thank you to Dionne Brand for this wonderful book. It's just been a wonderful invitation to sit with some really powerful thoughts and reflections. Great work, everybody. Good evening, good morning, good night, good afternoon, wherever you are. And I hope to see you online. Bye-bye.
Good dreams. Ciao.